There will be some handouts coming round, and there's a link to our website on there, so feel free to check out our website and see what we do. As well as that, I also do quite a lot of apologetics, and I'm aware that that is a ridiculous word and it doesn't mean what you think it would mean, so I'm just going to quickly define it, just because it was a while before I realised what it meant. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which is to give a reason or a defence, and it's basically the study of tricky questions. So on the other side of the handouts that you'll hopefully get is a link to the apologetics area of our website, which has got lots of helpful books and websites and things like that. And one person who I'd really like to flag up, who's great on apologetics and can help do what I'm trying to do here in a much better way, is a guy called Michael Ramsden, who works for RZIM. And if you just Google Michael Ramsden and conversational apologetics, there'll be a wealth of gold dust for you. I want to make it clear right at the beginning that I'm not saying that apologetics has all of the answers. But what I found over the years is that a lot of young people have really tricky head barriers that you've often got to kind of try and help them get rid of those before you can begin to share the gospel with them. So that's hopefully what we're going to try and do in a very short period of time. And I just want to share with you a story of a friend of mine, just to show you how this works in a kind of evangelistic context. She went into a school for a week and got to know the young people really well, and she encouraged them to bring their toughest questions, the things that they would desperately wanted to ask God. And she worked with them to work through some of the answers to those tricky questions. And at the end of that week, some of the most cynical teenagers there became Christians, as did their atheist teacher. So we're not talking about this in the kind of academia, cold, sterile learning. We're talking about it in terms of changing young people's lives. So you may have the handouts by now. If you don't, that's fine. We're going to be looking at 1 Peter 3, verse 15 to 16, which is a famous apologetics verse. We're just going to unpack that a little bit, and then we're going to have a go at answering some of those tricky questions ourselves. The verse says, "If someone asks you about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way." So first up, if someone asks. This verse assumes that people are asking us questions. So I guess the thing I want to challenge with us today is, are our young people, are our peers asking us questions because of the way we're living our life? Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said that your life as a Christian should make non-believers challenge question their disbelief. Your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. That's some pretty high stakes, isn't it? Are our lives making non-believers question their disbelief in God? So if someone asks about your Christian hope. Now, this is so tragic. Our young people are experiencing pain so early in their life, whether it's through family breakdown, through mental health issues, just through the terrifying stuff that they're seeing on the news. And actually, we need to show our young people that Christian hope doesn't just mean being happy all the time. Christian hope is so much deeper than that. It's the assurance that even when we're in the midst of the storm, that God won't let go of us. There was a study recently done on Facebook, and it said that the more someone uses Facebook, the less satisfied they are with their life. I mean, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? But this constant comparison of doctored photos, of exaggerated achievements, of fairy tale relationships is so damaging for our young people. We have an opportunity as youth workers to shine a light on this photoshopped culture. Instead of portraying our perfectly painted exterior, we've got the opportunity to share our whole lives with our young people, to share our lives without filter. And hopefully, if we're living in an honest and open way, then that gives our young people a glimpse into the hope that we have through our brokenness. They'll see God's hope. So if someone asks about your Christian hope, and here we get to the nub of it, always be ready to explain it. Now, there's tons of different ways that we can be ready to share our faith, and you're going to be hearing lots of amazing ways throughout today. But I want to whittle it down to 5 ways, which should be on your handouts. Create good relationships, ask good questions, understand a young person's worldview, tell your story, and encourage questions. So first up, create good relationships. We have got to meet our young people where they're at, not where we want them to be. I want to read a short extract from one of our magazines last year, and it's written by a guy called Patrick Reagan, who heads up XLP, which is a charity that works with young people on some of London's toughest estates. They do a lot of work with gang members. And in this article, he talks about one of their mentors who's called Derek. And Derek has just taken on a new young person called Luke. Luke was facing huge challenges within his family, and he was on his last warning before being expelled from school. For their first session, they arranged to meet for an hour in a local park at 5 o'clock. The mentor turned up 5 minutes early just in case, and he sat on a bench. It got to 5 past and Luke hadn't shown up, but Derek stuck around. At 15:15, Derek gave him a call and it went to voicemail. At 50:30, he called again, but no luck. At 6 o'clock, Derek had another look around and reluctantly went home without seeing Luke. The next day, Luke told Derek that something had come up, which is why he couldn't make it, and they arranged to meet at the same time, same place the next week. The next week, the time came and went, and Luke was nowhere to be seen again. Derek again waited on the bench before leaving. He rang Luke, who again offered his excuses, and they arranged a time the following week, and Luke again didn't show up. This happened 5 times. And on the 5th week, Derek turned up to the park 5 minutes early, wondering why he was bothering. He waited until 15:15 and was thinking about going home when out of nowhere Luke appeared and sat down beside him. Derek asked him where he'd been. Luke said that he'd been hiding behind a tree, and he pointed to the other side of the park. Luke later revealed that he'd been there every week for the last 5 weeks. Every week he waited to see if Derek would give up on him, but Derek never did. And Patrick goes on to say that apart from the mentoring training that we gave Derek, he had no particularly relevant youth work skills. And to be honest, any that he did wouldn't have helped him. What Derek had was a determination to hold on to the hope in the challenging times and to continue showing up. That kind of persistent and faithful love has the power to change lives. It's a pretty powerful story, isn't it? And it just shows us that if we don't give up on our young people, we can show them that there's a God who's never going to give up on them. So the first thing is to create good relationships. And then out of that place, once we've created those good relationships, we can ask questions. Now, questions are a really helpful thing because they can clear up all sorts of things. So they can clear up bad theology. I think for a lot of our young people, they reject the idea of God because they think of him as a mean headmaster or a vindictive kid with a magnifying glass smiting the ants. And actually, they think that if God did exist, he wouldn't like them. There's no understanding of the God that we believe in, a God who would do anything, did do everything to reconcile the world to himself. And so I think part of what we've got to do is to show our young people that we don't believe in the God that they don't believe in either. We don't believe in that type of God. And so one of the things that maybe we could do in order to try and clear up theology is ask a young person, do you think you're good enough to get into heaven? And that could be a way of starting a discussion around the fact that actually it's got nothing to do with being good. So they can clear up bad theology. Questions can help us to find out what our young people actually believe. There's a guy called Gregory Kukul who's written a book called Tactics, which is all about how we can use questions in evangelism. And in his book, he says, you may find that you've given a brilliant refutation of a view that the other person doesn't hold. We need to ask questions to find out what our young people actually think. Questions can help to put the ball back in their court. Understandably, lots of young people want us to defend our beliefs. Why do you think that? And that we should be ready to defend our beliefs. But when we ask questions to our young people, it gives us an opportunity to ask them to defend their beliefs. So for instance, if a young person comes up to you, potentially a young Muslim person, and says, actually, I think the Bible has been changed loads, rather than jumping back in with a load of facts, which we probably don't have on the tip of our tongue, you could say, why do you think the Bible's been changed? Is there anywhere in particular that you think it's been changed? And probably more importantly, what would it help for you to think that the Bible was reliable? Because then actually you have a much more engaging conversation. Questions can help steer conversations away from unhelpful issues back to the core gospel. And most importantly, questions show that we care. When we ask our young people questions, we're not lecturing them with our ready-made answers. We're saying, your opinions matter, we care what you think. So so ask questions, and then through questions, we can try and understand our young person's worldview. Does everyone know what worldview means? Because I'm aware that's like another word like apologetics, and it doesn't really make sense. It's basically the lens through which you look at the world. So I think it's really important to say from the offset that no one starts from neutral. It's not as if we come from a warped religious perspective and they come from, you know, philosophical Switzerland. We all come from a particular perspective. We all have a faith perspective, even if that's no faith, and we'll bring that perspective into our situations. We'll bring that worldview into our questions, into our thoughts. And our young people's worldview will be informed by all sorts of things, by their parents, by their friends, by their schools, by their culture. And actually, we live in a culture that is full of consumer. You know, we're constantly asking the question, what can I get out of this situation? What can I get out of this experience? It's a culture which is saturated with information, where constantly we want to know more, and we can fact check everything at the click of a button. It's a culture where we hear a lot about fake news, don't we? And actually, there's also fake theology and bad theology, like we've already seen. A lot of our young people, their theology will be informed by weird stuff they've read online, and actually, it's really hard to differentiate between false theology and good theology. It's a culture that's constantly switched on, where young people are desperate to avoid FOMO, the fear of missing out. And it's a culture where all opinions are equally valid, that what's true for me isn't necessarily true for you. So we need to be aware of our youth culture in order to speak more clearly into it. And there's a guy called David Kinnaman who has written a book called You Lost Me. And in that book, he says, it's not that they're not listening, it's that they can't understand what we're saying. It's not that our young people aren't listening, it's that they can't understand what we're saying. And actually, I think as youth workers, we need to learn to get rid of our Christian jargon. And we need to make our message simple and relevant, not to water it down in any way, but to make it simple and make it relevant. And one of the ways that we can make our message simple is to tell our story. Revelation 12:11 says that we'll overcome by the power of the... Sorry, quoting the Bible wrong, I'm going to start again. Revelation 12:11 says that we'll overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. Our stories are powerful, and different people's experiences will resonate with different young people. And I think when we think of testimonies, we tend to think of the big, life-changing, I was this and now I'm this. But actually, Jimmy Dale and the guys at the Church of England are trying to encourage youth workers to share with their young people stories of what's happened to them just in that week. So what if every single time we met our young people, in whatever context it is that you are in, we had a story to tell our young people about what God has done in our life that week? And that doesn't need to be massive. It could be, I prayed this and this happened. And actually, it doesn't need to just be the positive things. I think it'd be really helpful as well if we could share with our young people stories of what God's done in our life, even in the pain and in the struggles. So tell your story. And finally, encourage questions. Now, this is terrifying, but I really would encourage you to ask your young people to test what you're saying and to question what you're saying and to ask questions when they've got questions. I don't know what your context is, but maybe if you're in a school context or a youth group context, or maybe if you're in a community centre, you could put on an event where you get young people to bring all of their questions and you just have a go at answering them. And you might want to get someone in to help you with that. But I think it's really important to say that actually the best apologists in the world don't know all of the answers, because we can never know all of the answers. And there's a guy called Professor John Lennox, who was an Oxford maths professor, and he is an absolute wizard at answering some of the trickiest questions. And he says that actually it's really important to be able to say, I don't know, because when we say I don't know, we're showing the young people that we're on the same level as them. And actually, there are loads of great resources that you can look at. There's some on the back of your handouts. There's going to be some great resources, I'm sure, at all of the stands around here. But let's not be afraid to say, I don't know, when a young person asks a question that we honestly don't know the answer to. Perhaps what we could do is say to our young person, do you want to go on that journey with me? Should we try and find out those answers together? And then you can pray that in that journey, no matter whether they find the answers or not, that God reveals himself. And that's the key, isn't it? We've got to pray. That's the main way that we can get ourselves ready to share the gospel, is to pray, to get on our knees, to ask the Holy Spirit to give us insight into our young people's lives, to pray for soft hearts, to pray that they'll hear the gospel, to pray for us, pray for ourselves for wisdom, for courage, for compassion. Because when we pray, rather than trying to think of all the answers ourselves, it takes the pressure off us because it's not about us. It's about God revealing himself to the young people. We've got maybe like 5 minutes where I just want you to have a think, maybe get into groups of a few, and think, what are some of the big objections that your young people have in whatever your context is? And then I want you to try and have a go at answering some of those questions, thinking about those 5 things. How can I make it so that they can understand? What questions could I ask in that situation? How could I bring my personal story into that? And then I'm going to try and answer 6 of what I think are the trickiest questions. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and then I'm going to call you back to order. Go for it. Right, I'm going to call you back to order. I'm so sorry. I know we're just scratching the surface. But maybe you can carry on having these discussions in lunchtime. There might be time at the end as well. I just want to make sure we get to the end. But keep thinking of those questions, because it's really helpful to throw those ideas around. I am going to have a go now at some of what I think are the hardest questions, and I'm going to try and do them in sort of 2 to 3 minutes each, so please be aware that I am not in any way giving a deep theological understanding, and so I'm going to be glossing over stuff, so please give me your grace. And I'm not, again, saying that I have all of the answers, just these might be a few helpful things to say in these situations. So, first up, does science disprove God? You'll be amazed how many people still think that this is a huge issue. So what I would say is, if I'm going to boil a kettle, science can tell me the process of how that water's boiling. It can tell me how it's heating up. It can't tell me why I'm boiling that kettle. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Science can answer questions of how. It can't answer questions of why we're here, where we came from, things like love. Those belong firmly in the realm of religion. So science and God aren't opposite. They answer different questions, but they don't cancel each other out. So for instance, if I was to say to you, if I was to give you 2 different answers to where my iPhone came from, I could tell you that it was made up of component parts, that it was the dual ion exchange process at a molecular level, which is obviously what I'd tell you if you asked me where my phone came from. Or I could simply say Steve Jobs, the man behind my iPhone. And actually that's exactly the same as if we're looking at the world. They're both valid answers. We don't need to say it was science or it was God. They're both valid answers. They're just different answers, like with my phone. Christians believe that God created the world, that he's left clues as to why we're here, how he feels about us. But science tells us how it was formed, how it works. Science doesn't contradict God. If anything, it points straight to him. Albert Einstein said, "The more I study science, the more I believe in God." How can God allow suffering? This is obviously a massive one. And what I would first of all do is try and take God out of the picture and go through some of the major worldviews. And I'd be aware that I'm hugely generalising, so I'd make sure the young person knows that. And certainly in this context, I'm hugely generalising. But what I would do is take God out of the picture, so then you have got an atheist perspective. And in an atheist perspective, suffering is just part of the world. It's just part of the way the world is. So even asking why we're suffering is pointless. And in an atheist perspective, there's no higher power. There's no one to help you in your suffering. You and the people around you are the only people that can help with your suffering. I'm aware that that's very general. Then you've got the Eastern religions. And in Eastern religions, they would say that you're suffering because of an attachment to the world. And the only way to stop yourself suffering is to take yourself out of the world. So they talk about this thing called nirvana. And that word nirvana literally means extinction. That's the end point of meditation, nirvana. And if that means extinction, what it's saying is in order to get rid of the suffering, you have to extinguish who you are. You have to wipe out parts of your character, parts of your personality, the stuff that makes you who you are. So that's what Eastern religions would say. And then if we put God back into the picture, let's take something like Islam. Islam would say that everything is controlled and willed by Allah, and that includes suffering. So suffering in that picture is part of God's will, and therefore to question why you're suffering is to question Allah, which is blasphemy. So in an Islamic perspective, really, you've just got to accept your suffering. And then you get to Judaism and Christianity, where suffering is seen as not, it wasn't part of life as Yahweh intended. Suffering came into the world when we turned our backs on God. And so what I would say is that in suffering, the Christian answer to the problem of suffering, central to that is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and I'd gently take them through that. With Jesus' life, I'd show them the shortest verse in the Bible, which is that Jesus wept. Jesus' best friend in the whole world dies, and his reaction is exactly what ours would have been. He weeps. But he doesn't just weep. The Greek word that's used in John's Gospel literally means to snort like an angry horse. Jesus was raging. He was saying life shouldn't be like this. It wasn't created like this, and it's not going to be like this forever. We, in Jesus, have a God who refused to remain distant, but came into the midst of our suffering. So that's his life. Then we get to his death. At the heart of the Christian message is Jesus' broken and bleeding body. Because not only did he come to experience human emotions, he also came to experience the ultimate suffering, and the one that we're probably all most afraid of, death. But surely Jesus dying is just more suffering. How on earth does that help us? Well, the thing is, when we break stuff, there are consequences. I used to wonder why God couldn't just click his fingers and forgive us. But when we mess up, people suffer. And so what I'd use is an example of something where something's been broken. So recently I went to a hen do, and one of the activities that we did in a hen do was decorating cheap sunglasses with, cheap little jewels and things like that. And I'm busy putting super glue all over me, literally all over me. And at this point I hear a scream. I'm like, oh my goodness, what's happened? I turn around. Turns out my friend Francesca has been accidentally super gluing my friend Emma's £200 sunglasses. Ever so slightly embarrassing. At that point, Emma has a choice to make. I mean, who spends £200 on a pair of sunglasses anyway? But Emma has a choice to make. Does she forgive Francesca, or does she make Francesca pay £200 for a new pair of sunglasses, which would be fair enough? If she forgives Francesca, then Emma still has to pay that money from her own pocket. If she wants another pair of sunglasses, she's still got to pay £200. And in the same way, actually, when God forgives us, there's still a cost to be paid. Something is still broken. And Christians believe that at the cross, Jesus paid that so that we don't have to. And then we get to the resurrection. And actually, if Jesus rose from the dead, then that means that death isn't the end. So I take them to a book at the end of the Bible where it says that he'll wipe every tear from their eyes, and there'll be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. All these things are gone forever. And I think the thing that I would end with is that actually when I'm in my most painful situation, and I'd probably share with a young person what my most painful situation was, I don't want to know why I'm suffering. What I want is someone to pull me out of that situation and to hold me and to comfort me. And when a kid falls over and they hurt their knee and there's blood pouring down their knee, we don't tell them why they fell over and that the red stuff on their knee is blood. What we do is we pick them up and we hold them and we comfort them in their pain. And I think what Christianity does, it doesn't tell us why we're suffering, but it does show us a God who's not only been there, but who can hold us in their pain now. I'm going to answer now, why does God hate my gay friend? Oh, and getting so excited, I'm spilling stuff everywhere. Now, why does God hate my gay friend? I think even the way that question is framed, there's a huge amount of pain in that. Why does God hate my gay friend? So I would start off by apologising for any damage that the church or that Christians have done to that young person. Any impression that they have given that a young gay person wouldn't be welcome in the church or in our homes. And I would apologise because it's heartbreaking, but I would also apologise because it's not true. The church has never been, nor was ever intended to be, a museum of saints. It is a place for broken people to come and meet with a God who passionately loves them. And I would also make sure that they know that God loves everyone without exception. I'd explain that it says constantly in the Bible that God is love. Love isn't something that he just does. He is love. Love is at the very essence of who he is. So I'd say that God can't hate their gay friend because God loves them passionately. But But I guess really the question they're asking is, what does God think of my gay friend's sexual activity? And I don't have time to go into this now, but I think it's really important that you are aware of what your church thinks about this if you're answering within a church context. And if you are trying to stay within a conservative, traditional view of homosexuality, I would say that you really need to try and get some help. So there's some resources on the back of your sheet. There's a website called Living Out, which is gay Christians who feel very strongly called to a celibate lifestyle, and their testimonies are really powerful because it's something they've battled with themselves. So I would try and maybe point young people to that, watch those videos with them. I would also say that if you want to stick with the traditional perspective, we need to get a better theology of singleness, where actually singleness isn't a second-rate, broken alternative to being married. I mean, that's bigger than just homosexuality, but we need to do that. We need to let our young people know that actually you can have a fully satisfying life while being single. And within that, we need to remind them how important friendships are, those platonic, amazing, loving friendships that you can have within the church. And we also need to remind them of the theology of intimacy, that actually all of our desires, all of our fulfillments will be met in God. But I'm aware that all of those things, the theology of singleness and intimacy, are much harder to understand if they don't yet know God. And presumably they're asking this question because they think that God doesn't exist, because if he did exist, he'd hate their gay friend. So in which case, I would focus on identity. And so what I would do is say to that young person, you talk about your gay friend and why God hates your gay friend. Would your gay friend call you their straight friend, or would they just call you their friend? And actually, I think we spent far too long sort of calling ourselves by our sexuality rather than calling ourselves by who we are, loved children of God. And so I would tell those young people that they are not defined by their sexuality, but they are so much more than their grades, their family background, their desires. They are defined by God loving them. So the thing I would really just constantly do is say that whatever the Christian perspective is, whatever your church believes, that a young gay person is welcome because God loves them. Right, can you prove that God exists? Well, it depends what you mean by proof. Proof in its truest sense only exists in the realm of pure maths. So I can 100% always prove to you that 2 and 2 equals 4. But even in science, scientists have to use faith. They have to believe that there's order to the world. So they have to believe that if they do an experiment, that it will react in a certain way because certain forces like gravity are in place. And proof in science is probably similar to proof in a court of law. So in a court of law, they talk about proof beyond reasonable doubt. They can't mathematically prove that someone's committed that crime, but what they can do is present confessions, eyewitness testimony, documentary evidence, and that all sort of forms a picture of proof beyond reasonable doubt. And actually, that's what I think we have in Christianity. I don't think we have mathematical proof that God exists. And so I would go through some of these proofs with the young people and say that some of them will probably make more sense to you and resonate more, and some of them you'll think, that's not particularly proof. So the argument from morality, the idea that we have an inbuilt sense of right and wrong, the idea that most of us would instinctively believe that rape is wrong. Some people would argue that that sense of right and wrong points to a law inside of us, and that that law inside of us points to someone outside of us who's put that law in all of our hearts. The aesthetic argument, which is a really poncy name for the fact that art and beauty point to something outside of ourselves. So there's a character in a book called Chasing Francis who says this: the object of all great art is beauty, and it makes us nostalgic for God. The idea that actually when we see something, it makes us nostalgic. We're like, wow, that's so beautiful. And there's a guy called Francis Collins who's a really famous biologist, and he had lots of objections about God. He was an atheist, and lots of really clever colleagues would try and kind of talk to him about how God existed and how there was proof from this and this. And in the end, the thing that convinced him was seeing a beautiful frozen waterfall where he was like, oh my goodness, there's got to be a God because this is so beautiful. Then we've got the argument from desire, the fact that most of us are like, there's got to be more to life than this. So C.S. Lewis said, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I wasn't made for this world, I was made for another world. And then we've got the cosmological argument, which again is another Ponzi word. It comes from the Greek word cosmos, meaning universe. And it's the fact that the existence of a universe points to someone who put the universe there. So when in the 1930s the Big Bang Theory emerged, actually atheists did everything they could to chuck it out, because it talks about the earth having a beginning. And if the earth had a beginning, then it must have had something or someone that kick-started that process. Then we've got the argument from design. The fact that loads of scientists, even atheist scientists like Stephen Hawking, talk about the fact that the world is finely tuned. And by that they mean that if anything was going to change in the gases in the atmosphere, or if the sun was going to move, if the earth moved even slightly further away or closer to the sun, life would be impossible. And is it like that just because of chance? Or is it like that because someone made it so perfectly finely tuned? And within that argument from design is also the idea that humans are so complicated. And why are we so complicated? How did that come about? So Isaac Newton said, "In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence." And then you've got the argument from resurrection, which I don't have time to go into now, but that's a huge one. And actually, if Jesus rose from the dead, then that's pretty solid proof that Jesus was God. And also tied in with all of that is kind of the historical reliability of the Gospels. Again, on those handouts, there's some really good resources to go to. And then the final one, there's lots more than this, but the final one I'd probably talk about with a young person is personal experience, our personal experience of God being a proof that God exists. We talked about this when we talked about telling your story. And I'd go through all those proofs, and then I'd say to a young person, actually, it's up to you to decide which of those proofs would stand up in a court of law. And you need to decide if any of those are good enough to put your faith in it. Nearly there. If God made the universe, who made God? I quite often find that little people ask me this. And it's a great question, but it's actually a philosophical mistake. And I would explain that like this. It's a bit like asking, what does red taste like? And in philosophy, that's called a category error, because red belongs to the category of colours, not the category of flavours. Red doesn't have a taste. It's a bit of a nonsense question, if you like. And in a similar way, asking who made God is also a category error, because God doesn't exist in the category of made things. So the bass guitar that I played was made by Fender. The wonderful cakes that we ate earlier were made by the amazing catering team. God wasn't made. He exists outside of space and time, and therefore you can't talk about him being made. So a better question might be not who made God, but who made the world? And if I have a maker, who made me? Last question. How could a good God send someone to hell? I think this is probably coming from a real place of pain as well. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that young people might be asking this question because one of their relatives or friends has just died. So just be really aware and sensitive when you're answering this question. But I think there's two things that we need to bear in mind. The idea of judgment and the idea of choice. And so what I would do, the way they've asked that question, how could a good God send someone to hell? I'd ask them to unpack a little bit. What do they mean by good? Why do they think that God's good? And why does sending people to hell stop him from being good? So I'd turn it around on them and ask them the questions. And then I'd ask them to think of someone they knew who's been really wronged, who's had something awful done to them. And I'd say to the young person, how did you feel when that person was horribly treated? You want judgment, don't you? You want justice to be done when someone you know has been hurt. Because actually it's not loving to stand by and do nothing. You want them to be judged for that action. And I think we often think of judgment as a bad thing, but I think that's often because we're on the wrong side of judgment. We do something stupid and we're judged for it and we're punished, so we understandably don't like judgment because we think it's, we're on the wrong side of it. But actually, if you have been horribly hurt, you want to see justice done. It's loving to demand justice. And so I think we need to see hell in the context of judgment. We need to see that actually a good God, a God of love, is a God of judgment. And there's a guy called Michael Ott who's written a book called What Kind of God? And he says that actually the alternative to hell is even worse. The alternative is a God who doesn't care. So that's judgment. And then we get to choice. And it says in the Bible that God's desire is that no one would perish. That's in 2 Peter 3 verse 9, if you want to look it up yourself. And actually, God doesn't send us to hell. We choose it. C.S. Lewis says in The Great Divorce that there are two kinds of people: those who say to God, "Your will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Your will be done." So two types of people: those who say to God, "Your will be done," and those for whom God says to them, "Your will be done." So actually, when we go to hell, we've chosen it, your will be done. But thankfully, there is a way out because of Jesus' choice. So if we've chosen hell, actually Jesus chose something else. Jesus said, "Not my will, but your will be done," to God. And when Jesus chose that, he chose to lay down his life. He chose to take separation from God. He chose hell so that we don't have to. God has done everything possible to rescue us from hell. And we have been given the choice to accept that and therefore to not choose hell. So God does judge, but that's because it's the loving thing to do. But he also provides a way out. That is a really imperfect way of answering those questions, I'm aware, and there's so much more that can be said, and I'm sure you've probably got even more questions. But I would really encourage you to keep asking those questions, to keep thinking about those things together, to keep reading stuff, but also, like I said, not to be afraid of saying I don't know, of walking alongside those young people in the pain and in those questions, because actually sometimes we can find God in the questioning, can't we? It's not just like, oh, I've got the answer, I'm gonna believe perfectly now. And I just want to go back to that Bible verse, the 1 Peter 3:16 Bible verse. It ends, "But do this in a gentle and respectful way." We need to be aware, as we've already seen, that most of our young people's objections are not intellectual. They come from a real place of pain. They come probably from an emotional issue or a negative experience with a Christian, with the church. And so we need to be desperately compassionate. Tim Keller says that many people who take an intellectual stand against Christianity do so against a background of personal disappointment with Christians and churches. Often what I find is a young person will ask me a really clever question, and I'll, give a go at answering that question, and then I realise there's so many questions behind that question. So we need to be aware that there's lots of questions, and sometimes they want to ask something, but they're too scared or they're too embarrassed. So we need to be aware that there's often questions behind those questions. J. John said earlier that people don't care how much we know until we know how much we care. We're not here to win arguments, to tick off all of our clever answers. We're here to point people to Jesus. We need to be gentle, we need to be respectful, and we need to be willing to lose arguments to win people. Yes, we can arm ourselves with lots of helpful answers. Yes, we can think of really thought-provoking questions. Yes, we can quite literally love the hell out of our young people. But actually, it's God's job to draw our young people to himself. I want to end with a story of my friend, Dr. Vince Vitale, who is an amazing philosopher. And he was at a university mission, and he was giving talks all throughout the week. And he's incredibly clever, so the talks were all amazing. And he's also incredibly organised, so he'd planned all of the talks way in advance. And he was praying before one of the talks, and he really felt that God was telling him to put an extra PowerPoint into his presentation. So he went back to his room, changed the PowerPoint, added it in, goes down, ready to do the talk. In through the door walks this young Chinese girl, and one of the mission team meets this young Chinese girl and gets talking to her, asks what her name is, and she says that she's called Alva. And Dan, this guy from the mission team, says, that's a really interesting name. What does Alva mean? And she said, my name means by grace washed white as snow. He's like, by grace washed white as snow. Are you a Christian? And Alva says, no, I'm not a Christian. Why is that? Is that a Christian thing? And Dan's like, that's the heart of the Christian message, by grace washed white as snow. And he sort of talks to her about the gospel. And then they sit down and listen to Vince's talk. Vince does his whole talk, and then he gets to the point in his PowerPoint presentation where he'd added in that extra slide. And up on the screen appears Isaiah 1, verse 18. Though your sins are red as scarlet, they'll be washed white as snow. Alva just can't believe it. She's like, that's my name on the screen. And they had the immense privilege of praying with Alva to become a Christian. We need to pray that no matter what we do, no matter what clever answers we have, that God is drawing people like Alva to himself. God is working all those details out for that one person in the room. We need to pray for the one. XLP, that charity that Patrick Regan works for, that I was talking about when we were talking about the mentor, Derek and Luke, has as their tagline, I refuse to believe that this is a lost generation. Let's refuse to believe that this is a lost generation. Let's cry out to God for our young people, that loads of them will come back, maybe by some helpful things that we say to them, but maybe just because God has got their finger on them like he did with Alva. Let's ask him to equip us with everything that we need. So I'm just going to pray. We've actually got maybe like 10 minutes left. So I'm going to pray, but then maybe you want to get into groups and just pray for some of your young people, particularly ones that maybe you know struggle with some of these difficult questions. The Message version of John 10:10 says that Jesus came so that we can have life, more and better life than we could ever have dreamt of. And God, we know, because we've experienced that life that you have for us. And God, I pray that in everything we do, that it will be so obvious to our young people that that life is on offer to them. And I pray that you'll just give us a huge amount of wisdom in tackling some of these difficult questions. God, they're so hard and they come from such a place of pain. And I pray that you will help us to never be dismissive of young people's questions, but to ask questions to show them that we care. God, will you give us the words to say? Will you give us grace and humility? Will you give us everything we need? God, we just come to you with open hands, knowing that what we can offer is just pittance compared to what you can do. God, we ask that you will break out in power among our young people. That you will answer their questions in way more profound ways than we could ever imagine. That you will reveal yourself. Amen. I don't know whether you do want to just get into groups. I think it's about 5 minutes till lunch, so I don't know whether you do just want to get into groups and pray for some of your young people together.